Welcome back. We left Joshua pondering this crazy command to strike up the band. And Jericho falls. But what happens in the next chapter? Defeat up in the mountains at Ai. Why? Because of sin in the camp. Finally, in chapter 8, God gives victory over Ai, and his people respond with a renewal of the covenant at Ebal and Gerizim, where they built an altar and then divide in two, with half standing on the slopes of Mount Ebal and the other half opposite on the slopes of Mount Gerizim, and there they recite back and forth the curses and the blessings from Deuteronomy 27 and 28. And then in chapter 9, we read about the wily Gibeonites. So, chapters 6 through 11, Joshua leads the conquest, first into the central mountains, and then southern Canaan, and then finally northern Canaan, and then the narrator summarizes the conquest in chapter 11, beginning with verse 16 and running into chapter 12. Then Joshua 13 begins, "Now Joshua was old and advanced in years when the Lord said to him, 'Very much of the land remains to be possessed.' And yet, the narrator tells us that the land's being allocated to the tribes. Well, turns out the major threats have been vanquished, but the mission's not yet accomplished. God's judgment of sin and God's fulfillment of the promise of the land has not yet been complete. At this point, the task is delegated to the several tribes in their allotted territories. Faith and obedience are still key, which grabs my mind over to chapter 14 and our faithful friend Caleb. Listen to this faith-filled 85-year-old speaking to Joshua in chapter 14. "You know the word which the Lord spoke to Moses, the man of God, concerning you and me in Kadesh Barnea. I was 40 years old when Moses, the servant of the Lord, sent me from Kadesh to spy out the land, and I brought word back to him as was in my heart. Nevertheless, my brethren who went up with me made the heart of the people melt with fear. But I followed the Lord fully. So Moses swore on that day, saying, 'Surely the land on which your foot is trodden shall be an inheritance for you and to your children forever, because you have followed the Lord my God fully. And now behold, the Lord has let me live just as he spoke, these 45 years from the time that the Lord spoke this word to Moses, when Israel walked in the wilderness, and now behold, I'm 85 years old today. I'm as strong today as I was in the day that Moses sent me. As my strength was then, so my strength is now, for war, for going out, for coming in. So now give me this mountain about which the Lord spoke on that day. For you heard on that day that the Anakim were there with great fortified cities. Perhaps the Lord will be with me, and I will drive them out as the Lord has spoken." Some in class may be engaging in vocational ministry as a second career, or maybe a third. And the enemy may be taunting you from time to time. "Come on, you're over the hill. What can you do at this point?" I think some folks may have perceived Caleb as being over the hill, but they didn't know Caleb. They didn't know his heart. I wonder if they really knew his God, Emmanuel. Well, to fast forward, we get to chapter 23. There's another segue, and we're privileged to listen into Joshua's retirement party. In chapter 23, 5, he reminds them that this is still Yahweh's mission. Yahweh's Torah is still their final authority for faith and practice. He charges them to cling to Yahweh your God, who fights for you just as he promised. And then he goes on to rehearse the story of this promise project and challenges them to live holy lives. Now, therefore, fear the Lord and serve him in sincerity and in faithfulness. Put away the gods that your fathers served beyond the rivers and in Egypt, and serve the Lord. If it's evil in your eyes to serve the Lord, then choose you this day who you will serve, whether the God that your fathers served in the region beyond the river, or the gods of the Amorites in whose lands you dwell. As for me and my house, we will serve the Lord. And so, with those pivot points at the beginning of chapter 13 and chapter 23, we could outline the book. Section 1, the conquest, first 12 chapters. Section 2, the distribution of the land, chapters 13 through 22. And then, chapter 23 and 24, Joshua's farewell. Well, the book of Joshua narrates God's commitment to the promise for the sake of the nations and for his glory. It demonstrates that it's precisely because God so loved people that he so hates sin. Joshua teaches that faith includes buying into God's standard of holiness, both personally and corporately or communally. I think Joshua also teaches that faith involves coming to the place where the believer can say, "Nevertheless, not my will, but yours be done." I think Joshua teaches that mission accomplished is ever always only by his powerful presence. May he continue by his grace to work his holiness and abandonment and experience of his powerful presence into my life and yours. God bless. We'll see you in a bit.